The classic rock industry was one of the biggest criminal enterprises of the 20th century. They just had better lawyers than the mob. The golden era of music. Guitar gods and arena tours. But behind the leather jackets and the screaming crowds was an industry absolutely riddled with thieves and corporate vampires. Today we're going to name 10 of the worst scams. Let's go.
He take a thunder from the mountain. He take a lightning from the sky.
Let's start with something so stupid it sounds made up. John Fogerty wrote Proud Mary. John Fogerty wrote Bad Moon Rising. John Fogerty wrote basically the entire Creedence Clearwater Revival catalog that your dad won't shut up about. And then, in one of the most breathtaking acts of corporate audacity in music history, Fogerty was sued for plagiarizing himself. His label, Fantasy Records, run by one Saul Zaentz, owned the masters to everything CCR ever recorded. So when Fogerty released a solo song called The Old Man Down the Road, Zaentz sued him, claiming it sounded too much like Run Through the Jungle.
You got the high.
A song Fogerty also wrote. Zaentz literally argued that Fogerty had stolen from Fogerty. Fogerty won the case, but spent years unable to perform his own catalog without enriching the man he despised. One guy, one contract, career held hostage, completely legal, absolutely monstrous. Everyone knows Colonel Tom Parker was a ruthless manager who took 50% of everything Elvis ever earned. 50%. Not the standard 15 or 20. 50. But here is the detail that most people gloss over, and it is genuinely staggering. Parker blocked Elvis from ever touring internationally. No Europe, no Japan, no anywhere outside America for his entire career. And the reason had nothing to do with logistics or money or Elvis's health. Parker himself was an illegal immigrant. Born Andreas Cornelis van Kuijk in the Netherlands, he had entered the United States without documentation and could never leave without risking permanent deportation. So, the most famous entertainer on the planet never played for his millions of international fans because his manager had an immigration problem he refused to admit to. Elvis apparently never even knew. One man's secret passport situation canceled an entire global career.
To the open arms of...
Most villains are content with robbing one legendary band. Alan Klein was not most villains. Klein was an accountant from New Jersey who somehow convinced both the Rolling Stones and the Beatles to let him manage their finances. With the Stones, he negotiated a better record deal and then quietly kept the advance for himself. The band didn't find out for years. With the Beatles, he inserted himself during the chaotic Apple Corps period when the band was already falling apart and systematically redirected money in ways that took decades of litigation to untangle. Paul McCartney hated him immediately and said so publicly. He was overruled by the other three. Klein was eventually convicted of tax evasion in 1979 in a related matter and served 2 months in prison. 2 months for financially dismantling two of the greatest bands in human history. The justice system apparently also got scammed.
Sunday driver, yeah. I feel good.
James Brown is one of the greatest performers who ever lived. He is also, by every account from every musician who ever worked for him, an absolutely exhausting human being to be employed by. Brown ran his band like a particularly vindictive school principal with a spreadsheet. Every mistake during a performance was a finable offense. Wrong note, fine. Late entrance, fine. Shoes not shiny enough, fine. Tie slightly crooked, you guessed it, fine. These were not symbolic slap on the wrist amounts either. They came directly out of musician wages, meaning some band members were effectively working for almost nothing after Brown finished deducting his grievances from their paychecks. This went on for decades and was an open secret in the industry. Former band members have described it on camera with a combination of disbelief and resignation that is genuinely painful to watch. The godfather of soul was paying his musicians in vibes.
Love can't do me no harm. I feel nice. Yeah, reeling and rocking.
What a crazy sound. But they never stop rocking.
Here's a fun fact to ruin your next classic rock listening session. The Rolling Stones do not own their first 10 albums. Not partially. Not in a complicated licensing arrangement. They simply do not own them and never will. When Andrew Loog Oldham signed the Stones to Decca Records in 1963, he was 20 years old and the contract was catastrophic. Decca retained permanent ownership of the masters to everything the Stones recorded for them. No buyback clause, no reversion rights, nothing. This means every time you stream Sympathy for the Devil or Gimme Shelter, a meaningful portion of that money goes to a corporation rather than the band that made it. Mick Jagger is worth $300 million and cannot buy back his own recordings. The Stones have spoken about this with a very specific brand of resigned aristocratic bitterness that suggests even they have accepted it is simply gone forever.
And it's a long day living in a
Tom Petty is one of the most beloved figures in American rock history, which makes it genuinely enraging that his record label spent years treating him like a hostage. After his debut album, Petty was signed to a deal that seemed reasonable until ABC Records was sold to MCA, transferring his contract without his consent to a label he had never agreed to work with. When MCA then attempted to release his second album at a higher price point than competing records, Petty refused, called it price gouging his own fans, and declared bankruptcy specifically to void the contract. He was 28 years old. His label sued him. He sued back. The whole thing became a years-long legal battle that Petty documented extensively in later interviews with the kind of calm fury that makes for extraordinary television. He eventually won, but the fact that bankruptcy was the only available weapon tells you everything about the power balance involved.
a face in the crowd. Out in
Baby, baby, I'm aware of where you go. Each time you leave my door.
Berry Gordy built the most successful independent record label in American history, and he did it partly by making sure that everything his artists had, including their own identities, belonged to Motown. The contracts Gordy offered in the late 50s and throughout the 60s were constructed so comprehensively in the label's favor that artists who left Motown discovered they legally could not use their own stage names. The Four Tops, The Temptations, Martha Reeves, these were Motown assets, not personal identities. When acts tried to leave and continue performing, they faced immediate legal action. Gordy's system also kept artists almost entirely ignorant of their own finances, handling everything centrally and providing minimal accounting transparency. While this is slightly outside the core rock lane, it matters here because the system it pioneered was copied wholesale by rock labels throughout the 70s. Every entry on this list has Motown's fingerprints on it. Here's how the record industry turned generosity into a trap. Labels would advance bands all the money they needed to record an album. Studio time, producers, engineers, accommodation, everything covered. Very kind of them. Except every dollar spent was logged as a debt against future royalties, meaning the label recouped every penny before the artist saw a cent. And since the label controlled the studio budget, they had every financial incentive to spend as much as possible, running up costs that kept artists in permanent debt even while their records were selling millions. Def Leppard, Whitesnake, and dozens of other major 80s acts have spoken about finishing enormously successful album cycles and receiving royalty statements showing they still technically owed the label money. The label called it recoupment. A reasonable person might call it something else. The particularly elegant part of this scam is that it was all written clearly in the contract. You just had to know what you were reading. In 1985, a group of Washington wives calling themselves the Parents Music Resource Center launched a very public campaign against explicit content in rock and metal music. You probably know this story from Dee Snider's legendary congressional testimony, or Frank Zappa's magnificent contempt for the entire proceedings. What gets discussed less is what was happening behind the scenes. The major labels quietly supported the parental advisory sticker system that resulted from the PMRC campaign, not because they suddenly developed moral consciences, but because the administrative burden of compliance fell disproportionately on smaller independent labels who couldn't absorb it. The sticker system created a barrier to entry that disadvantaged independent competitors and consolidated power with the majors who were already dominant. The entire spectacle of Senate hearings about dirty lyrics was in part a coordinated market protection exercise conducted in front of an audience that thought it was watching a culture war. It mostly was. Just not only. Everything else on this list happened to famous people with lawyers and accountants, and at least some ability to fight back. This one happens to your local band. Right now. In your city. Pay to play is exactly what it sounds like. A venue offers a small band the opportunity to open for a recognizable touring act, charges that band several $100s for the privilege, then makes the band responsible for selling their own ticket allocation. If the tickets sell, the band might break even. If they don't, the band is simply out of pocket for the honor of loading their own equipment into a venue that just charged them for the experience. This practice became widespread in the 80s and never stopped. It is the most democratic scam on this entire list because it does not discriminate. Doesn't matter how good you are. Doesn't matter how hard you worked. Pay up or stay home. So there you have it. 10 ways the classic rock era separated talented people from their dignity and their money. Some of these villains went to prison. Most of them retired comfortably. If this made you angry, good. Like, subscribe and go check the contract you signed. Read the small print.